Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Welcome back to The Drowsy Historian. Tonight's hook is simple, a little sharp, and very purple. What if your alarm clock was a choir? Your morning outfit could bankrupt a province, and one wrong bow could get you quietly erased from the record, not with a sword, but with a pen dipped in imperial ink. That is the Byzantine Emperor's Day, a careful choreography where faith, fear, payroll, and pageantry all share the same narrow corridor. The palace is not just a house, it is a machine, and every corridor hums with rules, from the polished porphyry floors to the red boots that say you are above every other man breathing in Constantinople. The throne is heavy, yes, but the heaviest thing is the performance, because the performance keeps the empire stitched together, and a missed cue can pull a thread you cannot reweave. Chapter 1. Before sunrise, Vigil, bath, and the Chamberlains. The day of a Byzantine emperor did not begin with sunlight. It began with shadows and candlelight, when Constantinople still slept beneath its domes and tiled roofs. In the deepest blue of the pre-dawn hours, the great palace stirred quietly. Somewhere inside, behind thick walls painted with gold leaf and guarded by eunuchs in spotless robes, the ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire was already awake. He was not alone. The emperor's mornings were less a private routine and more a slow ignition of the machinery of court. Chamberlains whispering schedules, servants lighting lamps, the rustle of silk sleeves, and the muted slap of felted slippers on polished marble. Privacy was a luxury even an emperor could not buy. Every moment, even before he was dressed, was part of the performance. The vigil came first. This was no quick mumble of prayers before the day's business. It was an orchestrated devotional act. The emperor might attend a small chapel within the palace complex, where candles glowed against mosaics of Christ, Pantocrator, and the Virgin. Incense coiled into the rafters, sweet and smoky, clinging to embroidered curtains and the emperor's hair. The clergy on duty, often high-ranking and politically connected, would chant in deep, steady voices, each syllable timed with ceremonial precision. To modern ears, this might sound serene. To the emperor, it was also political theatre. Every bow, every kiss upon the gospel book was observed, remembered, and later repeated in court gossip. Failed to appear pious enough, and whispers of heresy could start, an accusation far more lethal than a sword thrust. Once the prayers ended, the transition to physical preparation began. The emperor's bath was less about hygiene and more about ritual renewal. In a heated chamber with marble basins and silver ewers, warm water was poured over him by attendants who had been inspected for loyalty as much as skill. Here, the court physicians would hover, checking his pulse, examining his eyes, ensuring the ruler looked healthy enough to embody imperial stability. A pale emperor was bad for public confidence, and if illness struck, the truth might be hidden behind layers of cosmetics and carefully timed appearances. Dark fact, more than one emperor had been quietly poisoned or smothered while resting in this vulnerable moment. History has left us hints, though the chroniclers were too cautious to write openly. The Chamberlains, those ever-present guardians of palace order, took over next. These eunuchs were not merely servants, they were gatekeepers to the emperor's time, power, and image. Marcos, our seasoned guide in this ritual, knew the unspoken rules, how to hand a towel without turning his back, how to speak in a tone that conveyed urgency without suggesting panic, how to keep the morning moving without making it feel rushed. Every object the emperor touched had been inspected, robes for stray threads, belts for proper stitching, even the sponge used in the bath for hidden toxins. Paranoia? Perhaps. But when the stakes were the survival of an empire, even soap was suspect. As the attendants laid out the first garments of the day, simple undertunics of fine linen, the ritual of dressing began. The ornate layers of state regalia would come later, for now, comfort and mobility were key. Yet even here, nothing was casual. The fabrics spoke silently of the empire's wealth, linen imported from Egypt, wool spun in imperial workshops, dyes from distant provinces. Every thread was a quiet reminder of the empire's reach. Anna, the sharp-eyed scribe we will keep close, often watched this stage from a respectful distance, noting in her mind the order of attendants, the sequence of garments, the jewelry that appeared or disappeared depending on political mood. She knew that changes in clothing often meant changes in policy. Lighter colors on the emperor could signal peace overtures, darker tones, a coming military campaign. The palace around them was waking, but not in the noisy way of common neighborhoods. It was a layered unfolding, the shuffle of the silentiarii clearing corridors, the metallic clink of keys as gates to inner chambers opened, the scent of baking bread from the kitchens that served the imperial household. In the stables, grooms prepared horses for possible processions later in the day. In the guard barracks, soldiers checked spears and polished helmets, not because they expected battle, but because dull bronze suggested dull discipline. By the time the emperor left his private quarters, he had already been prayed over, examined, washed, robed, and briefed on the day's initial schedule. To the outside world, his emergence might seem effortless, a serene figure gliding into the ceremonial heart of the palace, but every minute had been shaped by invisible hands. The morning was less about waking up and more about being constructed, piece by piece, into the living emblem of the Byzantine state. In this, the emperor was both man and artifact, breathing, thinking, but also curated, like a relic in a gilded case. And so, before the city's merchants opened their stalls, or the fishermen hauled their nets, the emperor's day had already been an intricate dance of faith, security, and presentation. For a ruler in Constantinople, the sun did not rise in the east. It rose in the palace, one candle at a time. The first step into the palace corridors was never just a walk. It was an announcement. The emperor, now fully robed in his morning attire, moved through halls lined with guards whose faces were fixed into an expression halfway between reverence and alertness. Their spears caught the light from oil lamps, gleaming as if they had been polished for hours, which they probably had, because dull metal reflected poorly on the discipline of the guard, and by extension, on the emperor himself. The Byzantines understood something modern politicians often forget. Appearances were not a side dish to power, they were the main course. Marcos, the Chamberlain, walked precisely 3 paces ahead, close enough to hear any low-spoken command, far enough to ensure the emperor's personal space was not breached. Every few steps, he would glance sideways at doorways, checking that silentiarii had done their job of clearing the path. In the Byzantine palace, silence was not the absence of noise. It was an engineered condition, as deliberate as the pattern on the mosaic floors. Every unnecessary cough, shuffle, or whisper could be taken as disrespect, and disrespect, however small, was the seed from which conspiracy could grow. This was the emperor's first moment of exposure for the day. The people he passed in the corridors, scribes hurrying with scrolls, minor officials hoping for eye contact, were not casual encounters. Every face had been placed there for a reason. Some to be rewarded with a nod, others to be ignored as a subtle warning. Anna, who had spent years deciphering such silent messages, could read a corridor the way a general read a battlefield. The tilt of the emperor's chin might indicate favor. The flicker of an eyelid could mean someone's career had just been cut short. It was a quiet cruelty, but cruelty nonetheless, and it kept the court disciplined. The palace itself was a city within a city, with layers of gates, gardens, chapels, and audience halls. Passing through the first major portal of the day, the emperor entered the more public zones of the great palace complex. Here, the scents changed. Less incense, more baked bread and sea air drifting in from the Marmara. Courtiers, who had been waiting in the periphery, now stepped into the edges of the procession, heads bowed, hands clasped. None spoke unless addressed. One wrong word before the emperor had even had his morning meal, and you could find yourself posted to some distant, mosquito-ridden outpost in Anatolia. Before moving to the day's first audience, the emperor would often take a brief report from the Protospatharios, commander of the guard. This was usually a low-voiced summary of the night's watch, any fires in the city, disturbances in the Hippodrome district, or whispers of unrest in the markets. Most days, it was mundane petty theft, drunken brawls, but sometimes there were darker notes. A foreign spy caught near the harbour, a disgruntled noble sending too many messages to relatives in the provinces. In such cases, the emperor might not react outwardly at all, which was its own kind of intimidation. If your treachery had been noticed but not punished immediately, you would spend every waking hour waiting for the axe. Sometimes literally. The path to the audience chamber was a slow reveal of imperial power. Floors of polished porphyry stone, pillars of green Thessalian marble, walls inlaid with gold tesserae depicting saints and emperors past. Every surface was a reminder of continuity and authority. Critics might say it was a grotesque display of wealth in a city where beggars still lined the outer streets. And they would be right, but the Byzantines had perfected the art of making extravagance look like necessity. To them, the majesty of the palace was not waste. It was proof of divine favour, a visual sermon that the empire was blessed and eternal. Occasionally, the emperor would stop to acknowledge a relic displayed in a small side chapel along the way, perhaps a fragment of the true cross, or a saint's relic encased in gold and crystal. These gestures were brief, but loaded with meaning. The act of touching the reliquary, or crossing himself in front of it, was not just piety. It was a public reminder that his authority flowed from God's will, not just from armies or laws. In a court where theology could ignite riots, skipping such a stop would be noticed and questioned. As the audience chamber doors came into view, the atmosphere tightened. Guards stood straighter. Courtiers adjusted their robes. Anna once observed that this moment was like the hush before a theatre curtain rose. Every player knew their mark, and every eye would soon be on the central figure. But unlike a stage, there was no applause here, only controlled acclamations delivered in deep, rehearsed voices, echoing through the vaulted hall. The emperor's day was about to open to the broader machinery of governance, petitions, ceremonies, and carefully managed displays of magnanimity or wrath. But the seed of that day's tone had already been planted in these early hours. The vigilance of the chamberlains, the silent signals of the corridor, the measured pace through the palace's symbolic geography. It was not just a walk, it was the opening act of the empire's daily performance. From this point forward, the private man would recede behind the public mask. And in Byzantium, masks were not just for concealing, they were for ruling. Chapter 2. Dressing the Purple. The Robing Ceremony. If the early prayers and silent procession through the palace corridors were the prelude, then the robing ceremony was the overture, slow, deliberate, layered with meaning. Dressing the emperor was not simply about covering him in cloth. It was about building the visual embodiment of imperial authority, stitch by stitch, until the man beneath was half forgotten and the image of the emperor alone remained. The Byzantines did not believe in half measures when it came to clothing their ruler. This was the empire of purple, and purple was not a colour you simply wore. It was a statement that you were chosen, sanctified, and entirely above the rest of humanity. The room where this transformation took place was not a private dressing chamber in the modern sense. It was a controlled environment where only the most trusted could enter. The protovestiarios, keeper of the imperial wardrobe, senior chamberlains, and perhaps a single guard officer. Even here, in this most intimate of spaces, nothing escaped formality. The air smelled faintly of cedar chests and mastic incense, a blend of preservation and piety. Robes were stored in carved cupboards, folded with care, each separated by sheets of fine linen to prevent wear. The garments were not mere outfits. They were investments, political tools, and sometimes even weapons. The emperor began in his undertunic, already of such fine weave that most citizens would never touch its equal in their lifetime. Over this came layer upon layer, each with its own meaning. First, a soft linen tunic dyed white, symbolizing purity and the emperor's role as God's chosen ruler. Then, an outer tunic, often of silk dyed, in shades only the imperial household could legally wear. This monopoly on certain colours was not fashion snobbery, it was law, enforced by penalties that could range from confiscation to blinding. Yes, blinding. Wearing imperial purple without permission was considered a direct challenge to the throne. The Byzantines did not take colour theft lightly. Marcos, the chamberlain, knew the choreography by heart. Two attendants would lift the garment, never letting it touch the floor, and settle it over the emperor's shoulders in a smooth, practiced motion. The belt, often heavy with gold plaques or jewels, was fastened with the kind of ceremonial gravity one might reserve for locking a fortress gate. This was not mere decoration. Belts symbolized readiness to rule and, if needed, to fight. The weight was intentional, a physical reminder to the emperor of the burdens he carried, or was supposed to carry. Then came the chlamys, the imperial cloak. This was the garment that most visibly marked him as the emperor, dyed in the deep Tyrian purple extracted from thousands of murex snails. Each cloak was worth a small fortune, not because of the silk alone, but because of the sheer labour involved in producing that impossible shade. Even the smallest stain or fray would be an insult to the dignity of the throne. The edges were often embroidered with gold thread in patterns of eagles, crosses, and laurel wreaths, each stitch reinforcing the narrative of divine sanction and military triumph. Finally, the pièce de résistance, the red boots. No one else in the empire could wear them. The moment the emperor's feet slid into them, the transformation was complete. He was no longer a man preparing for a day's work. He was the living embodiment of the Roman state. Anna, from her post-recording ceremonial details, often noted how even the emperor's posture changed once the boots were on. Shoulders squared, chin lifted, whether from habit or from the literal support of the stiff leather, it hardly mattered. The effect was the same, an impression of unshakable authority. Of course, beneath the grandeur, there was always a whisper of irony. This was an empire that claimed to inherit the glory of Rome, yet its survival often hinged on cloth and ceremony as much as on swords. Critics, quiet ones, for their own safety, might mutter that it was all an expensive illusion, a gilded cage of symbolism. But the Byzantines understood better than anyone that in politics, illusions are not weakness, they are currency. If the sight of the emperor in full regalia could make an ambassador think twice about rebellion or sway a wavering ally, then every gold thread had earned its keep. Still, the process could be absurdly delicate. There are records of emperors refusing to appear because a seam was crooked or the dye had come out too dark. Entire audiences were delayed because the embroidery on the cuff did not align with the ceremonial pattern prescribed decades earlier. The protovestiarios bore the brunt of the blame in such cases, and careers could end over what modern eyes would call a fashion mishap. But to the Byzantines, these were not fashion choices. They were breaches in the armour of authority. When the last clasp was fastened and the final inspection completed, Marcos gave the subtlest nod. The doors would open soon. Outside waited not just courtiers, but the empire itself, envoys, supplicants, and watchful rivals. The emperor would step forward, and no one would see the man who had been bathed and dressed by careful hands. They would see only the office, wrapped in silk and purple, radiating a majesty that, in truth, took an army of attendants to construct. From this moment on, he was no longer allowed the luxury of being ordinary. The robing was not just preparation, it was transformation. And in Byzantium, transformation was survival. Once the emperor was wrapped in the purple cloak and crowned with the invisible weight of expectation, the robing ceremony shifted from purely practical dressing into a carefully timed political event. This was the moment when select members of the court, ambassadors, and sometimes even visiting dignitaries were allowed to witness the final touches, not because they needed to see the emperor's wardrobe, but because they needed to see how impossible it was to imagine him as anything other than sovereign. The attendants moved with an almost hypnotic precision, each trained to perform their part without hesitation. Even the smallest misstep could be read as an omen. If the clasp of the cloak stuck, if a belt was buckled unevenly, someone somewhere in the empire would whisper about the will of God turning against the emperor. In an age where divine approval was the cornerstone of political legitimacy, these whispers were more dangerous than any army. It is no wonder, then, that before the emperor stepped into public view, every fold was straightened, every jewel checked for its sparkle, and every seam inspected as if it were a battle line. The protovestiarios, master of the imperial wardrobe, was more than a glorified tailor. He was a political sentinel, the guardian of one of the empire's most potent symbols. The wrong choice of embroidery could insult an allied ruler. An outdated style could make the emperor look weak. There are records of diplomatic tension flaring over nothing more than the presence or absence of a particular motif in the imperial garment, because in the Byzantine mind, such details weren't aesthetic trivia, they were coded messages. Marcos, always attuned to the subtler undercurrents, had his own unofficial role here, to watch the emperor's mood. A good chamberlain knew that a ruler irritated by a tight collar or uncomfortable fabric could carry that irritation into the audience chamber, where it might manifest as sudden hostility toward an unfortunate petitioner. And, because Byzantium was an empire where personal moods often became state policy, an ill-fitting robe could in theory start a political feud. It sounds absurd, until you remember that entire wars have been sparked by less. The ceremony also served as a controlled exposure to the inner circle. Those allowed in this chamber were being reminded of their closeness to power, while also being put in their place. The emperor stood in the center, a still figure while others moved around him. This inversion, servants in motion, ruler motionless, was intentional. It signaled that while the machinery of state must bustle and labor, the emperor himself existed above such exertions, his role being to radiate authority rather than chase it. It was a masterclass in passive dominance. Anna, watching from the periphery, mentally catalogued each element of the regalia. The jeweled loros sash, wound in a precise diagonal across the torso, spoke of Roman imperial continuity. The golden fibula pinning the cloak reflected light toward the onlookers. Yes, even the sparkle was weaponized. She noted how the layering of garments subtly exaggerated the emperor's frame, making him appear taller and broader. These were the optics of majesty, achieved without a single word. There was, however, a quiet cruelty beneath all this splendor. Every robe, every boot, every gem had been purchased at the expense of someone's labor, and often someone's suffering. The Tyrian purple dye required thousands of murex snails, harvested and processed in conditions that stank so badly entire neighborhoods were avoided for the smell. The gold thread came from mines, where laborers rarely lived long enough to enjoy their pay. Critics might argue carefully that the emperor's clothing was stitched together from the lives of the empire's least fortunate. But in the Byzantine court, such truths were not to be spoken aloud. Instead, the splendor was framed as a shared triumph, proof that the empire was still mighty, still favored by heaven. When the final inspection was complete, the chamberlains stepped back in unison. A hush fell over the room, the kind that made the skin on the back of your neck tighten. The double doors at the far end were ready to swing open. Beyond them waited the Chrysotriklinos, the golden reception hall where the emperor would begin his public duties. But the transition from private to public was never abrupt. It was choreographed to remind everyone that they were not just seeing a man enter a room, but witnessing the appearance of an institution older than their grandfathers' grandfathers. The emperor would take a moment, holding himself still, as though gathering the aura around him. This pause was not vanity, it was strategy. It allowed the silence outside the doors to deepen, so that when they finally opened and he stepped forward, the contrast would be all the more striking. And when that happened, the line between human and symbol would blur almost completely. The robing was finished. The emperor was no longer a man in his private chambers. He was the embodiment of the Byzantine state, prepared to sit in judgment, command armies, and receive the prostrations of those who would rather be anywhere else. And all of this had been achieved before breakfast. Chapter 4. The Golden Hall, Morning Audiences in the Chrysotriklinos. The Chrysotriklinos was not a room you walked into casually. Even the name, the Golden Reception Hall, announced that you were stepping into the empire's most polished stage set. Its octagonal walls glimmered with gold mosaics depicting Christ, the Virgin, angels, and the emperors themselves, arranged so that divine and mortal authority merged seamlessly into a single glittering tapestry. Light from clerestory windows filtered down like liquid honey, catching the polished marble floor and making it feel less like stone and more like a surface you could fall through into heaven, or, depending on the emperor's mood, somewhere less pleasant. The emperor's throne dominated the center, placed under the dome so that every word spoken from it would carry. This was not simply a piece of furniture. The Byzantines had a flair for mechanical drama, and this throne could rise subtly, as if the emperor were levitating, or be flanked by gilded lions that moved their heads and roared at pre-arranged cues. It sounds like a detail from a medieval fable, but eyewitnesses confirm it. Imagine being an ambassador from some smaller kingdom, already nervous, when the ruler you're petitioning not only sits higher than you, but has metallic beasts glaring at you like they'd prefer you as lunch. Subtlety was not the point. Dominance was. The audience began the way all such ceremonies did, with noise. The professional acclamators repeated their chants in deep, rhythmic waves, punctuated by the occasional blare of a trumpet or clang of cymbals. The Byzantines had perfected the art of overwhelming the senses, because a mind awash in sound and colour is less likely to think critically. Marcos, standing slightly behind the throne, took in the hall like a man reading a map. He noted which foreign envoys shifted uncomfortably, which senators' eyes darted to each other in silent conversation, and who looked entirely too confident for their own good. Petitions were heard in strict order. A high-ranking general might step forward first, bowing in a precisely measured arc, followed by a bishop with grievances about property disputes, then an envoy from a border province bringing news. Whether good or bad was almost secondary to the way it was delivered. The emperor responded in sparse, deliberate phrases, often repeating the petitioner's name in a tone that suggested both familiarity and authority. When he approved something, he did not smile. When he rejected it, he did not frown. His stillness was the message, "I am unmoved by your theatrics, you are moved by mine." It was not unusual for the audience to include a little light punishment. Perhaps a noble accused of corruption was summoned forward, publicly reprimanded, and fined on the spot. Or worse, banished to a monastery in some desolate mountain region. In the Byzantine moral code, this was mercy compared to execution, though the exiles often described it as a slow form of erasure. Anna, scribbling at her desk, knew these moments would be dressed up in the official records. His Majesty, with great clemency, removed the offender from temptation. The reality was plainer. You're done here. Disappear quietly. Between petitions, the palace guards shifted positions with deliberate formality. This constant movement wasn't just to look impressive, it was a visible reminder that the emperor was never unprotected and that any misstep could be met with force. The Varangian Guard, towering northern mercenaries wielding massive axes, stood at the periphery, their presence both exotic and terrifying. Rumour held that they had no ties to the local nobility and thus could be trusted to enforce imperial will without hesitation. A wise ruler surrounded himself with men who had nothing to gain from his fall. The sheer slowness of the proceedings was part of the design. The Byzantines understood that time itself could be a weapon. If you wanted to make a petitioner feel small, you made him wait under the unblinking gaze of saints and soldiers until his own thoughts turned against him. If you wanted to make an ally feel honoured, you called him forward swiftly, as though you'd been eager for his arrival all morning. Every moment was scripted, every pause a line in the imperial play. And still, for all the grandeur, the cracks showed to those who knew where to look. The gold on some mosaics was thinner than it had been decades ago. The carpets, though still lush, bore faint marks of wear. Behind the roar of the crowd, the empire's finances were groaning under the weight of constant war and lavish court life. Marcos knew it. Anna knew it. Perhaps the emperor knew it too. But here, in the Chrysotriklinos, reality was painted over in gold leaf and sung into submission by a chorus that would not dare to stop. From here, the emperor's day would move into smaller, more intimate settings, where the conversations would be less ceremonial and far more dangerous. But for now, the morning audiences served their purpose. The empire had seen its ruler, and the ruler had been reminded of the delicate balance that kept the illusion of control intact. The morning audience rarely ended with a grand conclusion. There was no "thank you for coming" or sweeping bow from the emperor. Instead, the final petition faded into a pause, and the emperor simply shifted his gaze away, a silent signal that the formal part of the ritual was over. It was abrupt, almost anticlimactic, and entirely deliberate. The Byzantines believed in ending on their terms, not the visitors'. By denying closure, the emperor left petitioners with the lingering sense that the interaction was unfinished, and that they were still bound, psychologically, to him. Once the last petitioner had stepped back, the guards moved into action with a quiet efficiency, clearing the centre of the hall. Courtiers, in the front rows, began the slow, measured retreat that etiquette demanded, bowing at every third step. Those in the back rows melted away like shadows, careful not to turn their backs on the throne until they had passed the invisible line, beyond which normal movement was permitted again. Marcos, still stationed at the emperor's shoulder, scanned for any deviation from protocol. The rules were ironclad. Any sign of haste, reluctance, or sloppy respect could be interpreted as a subtle act of defiance. While the hall emptied, Anna's quill kept moving, capturing the final details, the precise wording of the chants, the sequence of petitions, the facial expressions that could later be interpreted in more than one way. She was not writing history, as a modern reader would expect. This was a curated truth, a version of events that made the empire look orderly, devout, and strong. If someone had trembled, she might describe it as proper awe. If someone had looked bored, she would note calm composure. The palace records were less about accuracy and more about shaping a narrative the emperor could live inside comfortably, and there was plenty to cover up. Not every petition was worthy of the gold mosaics and trumpeting acclamations. Some were absurd nobles squabbling over fishing rights, merchants complaining about the price of imported silk, clerics demanding the removal of a bishop who had the misfortune of disagreeing with them in public. These moments were endured, not cherished, and often cut short with a vague promise to consider the matter. The trick was to make the petitioner feel heard without committing to anything costly. Then there were the calculated humiliations. The emperor might allow a provincial official to kneel before him for several minutes without acknowledgement, forcing the man to sweat under the gaze of the court. Or he might interrupt a petitioner mid-sentence to address someone else entirely, sending the clear signal that the speaker was irrelevant. Byzantium's cruelty was rarely loud. It was slow, surgical, and designed to bruise pride rather than bodies, though bruised bodies weren't unheard of if the Varangian guard decided someone had overstayed their welcome. As the last clusters of courtiers withdrew, the soundscape of the Chrysotriklinos shifted. The chants stopped, the guards' boots echoed against the marble, and the distant thrum of the city seeped in through the high windows, market sellers calling out prices, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, gulls shrieking over the harbours. For the first time that morning, the emperor was not the centre of a carefully engineered soundstorm. It was a brief, fragile moment of stillness, though it never lasted long. What followed was a quieter but no less important phase, the controlled drift into smaller discussions. Ambassadors who had travelled far might be escorted to private chambers for more delicate negotiations. Senior ministers might follow the emperor into an adjacent hall for whispered policy talks. Marcos knew these transitions were dangerous moments. The shift from public ceremony to semi-private conversation was when informal influence could be exerted. A single sentence, murmured in passing, could change the direction of an entire policy before it was even discussed in council. The emperor rose from the throne only after the hall was nearly empty. The lions beside him stilled, the mechanism locked. His movement was deliberate, slow enough to seem regal, but fast enough to avoid looking like he needed assistance. The robe swayed just enough to remind onlookers of its heavy embroidery. The boots clicked against the floor in a measured rhythm. He was, in every step, still performing. Because in Byzantium there was no such thing as offstage. Even the walk between rooms was a scene in the ongoing play of imperial life. Behind him, servants began the restoration of the hall for the next use. Incense was burned to refresh the air, stray dust was swept away, and the gold surfaces were polished to maintain their illusion of untouchable perfection. The Chrysotriklinos had done its job for the morning. It had shown the empire its ruler, and it had reminded the ruler that every gaze in the room was a thread in the tapestry of his survival. From here, the emperor would step into the more intimate and arguably more dangerous realm of private petitions and ministerial briefings. The stage would shrink, but the stakes would rise. In the Golden Hall, the emperor ruled by spectacle. Beyond it, he would rule by strategy. And strategy, unlike spectacle, left far less room for error. Chapter 5. Bread and Justice, Almsgiving and Petitions. After the shimmering theatre of the Golden Hall, the next act in the emperor's daily performance was staged in a very different tone, but no less deliberate. Here, the stage was not gold and mosaic, but the colonnaded courtyard where the empire pretended to remember its humble Christian roots. Bread and justice were the themes, and in Byzantium both were tools sharper than any sword. The courtyard had been prepared long before the emperor's arrival. Baskets of bread, real bread, not the sweetened loaves reserved for palace banquets, sat neatly stacked under a silk awning. Servants in plain livery arranged them as though they were relics, though anyone from the poorer districts of Constantinople would tell you the loaves were modest at best. What mattered was not their quality, but the act of giving. The crowd here was carefully mixed. A scattering of actual poor folk allowed in by the Chamberlains, a larger number of approved supplicants whose petitions had already been vetted, and a selection of church representatives invited to bless the emperor's charity. Marcos led the way again, ensuring the path was clear. The emperor entered to murmurs rather than chants. This was the pious half of the day, where humility was meant to be on display. He did not bow to anyone, of course, but his steps were slower, his gaze softer, at least in appearance. In truth, this was still politics. Almsgiving was less about compassion and more about public messaging. I am your father, your protector, the one who keeps bread in your hands and justice in your city. The bread distribution began with a blessing from a senior cleric who invoked the emperor's name alongside Christ's, as though the two were in casual partnership. Then the emperor took the first loaf from the basket and handed it to a waiting child, ideally one clean enough not to ruin the image, but ragged enough to make the contrast work. The crowd approved. Anna, watching from a shaded corner, noted how the moment was staged for maximum visibility. Courtiers would later recount it as proof of the emperor's benevolence. Never mind that the city's bakeries were tightly controlled by imperial decree, and grain prices could be raised overnight if the treasury demanded it. Once the symbolic loaves were handed out, the petitions began. This was the part where justice took centre stage. People stepped forward with grievances, land disputes, thefts, accusations of corruption. Most of these were already known to the officials and had been carefully selected for their utility. The emperor might publicly side with a poor widow against a negligent magistrate, especially if the magistrate was already out of favour, or chastise a wealthy merchant for price gouging during a famine. Such rulings, made on the spot, were less about fairness and more about optics. Punishing someone of rank showed the crowd that no one was above the law. In reality, the law bent all the time, usually toward whoever was closest to the throne. The petitions also allowed for targeted warnings. A noble family edging toward rebellion might find one of its members accused, fined, or stripped of privileges in front of the assembled crowd. It was humiliation with a soft veneer of legality. If the condemned protested too loudly, guards would escort them away. A scene that doubled as entertainment for the onlookers and a cautionary tale for everyone else. Dark facts lurked behind the spectacle. Many of the so-called random petitions were staged in advance. The petitioners coached on what to say and how to act. Some were even palace servants in disguise, paid to make the emperor's rulings look wise and generous. The Byzantines were masters of controlled reality, and the bread and justice ritual was an early form of public relations, carefully balancing mercy with menace. Marcos had his own role here, watching the crowd for unscripted moments, a muttered insult, a sideways glance between two men, the faintest sign of organized dissent. He knew that in this city, where riots could be sparked over chariot races, any public gathering was an opportunity for trouble. His eyes rarely left the edges of the crowd, where true malcontents preferred to linger. Anna, meanwhile, scribbled down the rulings with the precision of a court stenographer. In the official record, there would be no mention of staged petitions or strategic punishments. Instead, the entry might read, His Majesty, in wisdom and piety, dispensed bread to the needy and rendered judgment in accordance with divine law. The line between history and performance blurred so thoroughly that future generations might genuinely believe the day had unfolded exactly as written. When the last loaf was gone and the final petitioner dismissed, the emperor offered a blessing to the crowd, another symbolic act, accompanied by the sign of the cross and a murmured prayer. The people bowed, some in genuine reverence, others in the calculated deference that kept them on the safe side of power. Then the emperor turned, the bread baskets now empty, and walked back toward the palace interior. The image of benevolence had been successfully projected. Whether or not the city's poor would eat tomorrow was another matter entirely. The walk back from the bread courtyard to the palace's inner halls was intentionally slow, not because the emperor's legs required it, though some emperors in history did suffer from ailments that made swifter movement impractical, but because every step was still part of the day's unending performance. The path wound through colonnades where the city's elite and religious officials waited to catch the emperor's eye. One respectful nod here, one cool glance there, each a calculated micro-interaction that could raise or lower a career's trajectory. Marcos kept pace at the emperor's side, reading the subtle choreography of faces as they passed. There was the bishop whose lips moved silently, either in prayer or in a quiet plea for imperial favour. The merchant guild representative, who bowed slightly too late, earning himself an invisible mark on the Chamberlains' mental ledger. And the noblewoman, technically too low in the social hierarchy to be here, whose sudden presence suggested either a carefully pulled string or a dangerous disregard for protocol. In Byzantium, Both could lead to interesting consequences. Back inside, the petitions continued, but here, in the more private audience rooms, the tone shifted. Gone were the orchestrated cries of the crowd or the symbolic handing of bread. Now, the air smelled faintly of parchment and ink, and the voices were softer, more urgent. Petitions here were delivered by men and women of influence, and the matters they raised rarely had anything to do with hungry bellies. These were disputes over land boundaries between monastic estates, requests for tax exemptions, quiet accusations of treason, dressed up as concerns for the common good. The emperor listened, or appeared to listen, with the same inscrutable composure he had worn in the courtyard. Sometimes he would speak briefly, delivering a verdict on the spot if the issue was simple or politically advantageous. Other times he would nod and say, "Let it be examined," which was court shorthand for "I will decide later, and you will sweat until I do." This was a kind of justice, but a justice wielded with surgical precision, favouring timing over speed. In Byzantium, the waiting was often the punishment. Anna, positioned with her writing desk in the corner, took careful notes, aware that every word she recorded could be used later as precedent or as a weapon. She knew the unspoken rule: nothing was ever truly forgotten in imperial politics. A complaint dismissed today might resurface years later if it became convenient to use it against the petitioner. Her job was not only to record, but to keep the record malleable enough to fit whatever narrative the future required. The emperor's charity, though celebrated publicly, was far from limitless. If a petitioner's request risked upsetting a powerful ally, the emperor could deftly sidestep the matter by assigning it to a council that would review it for months or even years. And yet, occasionally, a decision was made swiftly and generously, often when the cameras of court life were still rolling, so to speak. A particularly photogenic act of mercy could be retold by courtiers for weeks, spreading the image of a ruler whose heart was as gilded as his palace ceilings. But the darker side of this charity was always present. Bread distribution was seasonal, tied to public festivals or political needs, not to the rhythms of hunger in the streets. Petitions for justice were filtered through a web of bureaucrats who understood exactly what outcomes their superiors preferred. It was an empire where fairness was a relative term, where even acts of mercy were weighed for their political yield before being granted. Marcos, who had spent decades in this machine, saw no contradiction in any of it. To him, this was the nature of power. You gave enough to keep the people loyal, punished enough to keep them afraid, and wrapped it all in the incense of divine sanction. The bread might feed a family for a day, the ruling might resolve a feud for a season, but the memory of the emperor's presence, that was meant to last for generations. When the last petitioner departed, and the ink on Anna's parchment began to dry, the emperor would retire briefly to prepare for the next stage of the day. This was not rest, it was recalibration. He would shift from the role of public benefactor and judge to that of strategist, ready to hear the latest reports from the empire's farthest provinces. The bread had been given, the justice dispensed, or at least displayed, and the audience was over. But in the Byzantine court, the performance never truly ended. It simply changed costume. Chapter 6. Quills and Seals, running the empire from a desk. The shift from bread and public justice to the imperial desk was like stepping from a painted stage into the backstage machinery that kept the show running. Gone were the chants, the ceremonial cloaks, and the baskets of bread. In their place came scrolls, ledgers, wax tablets, and the scent of fresh ink mingling with the faint mustiness of parchment that had travelled from the far ends of the empire. Here, in the working heart of Byzantine administration, the emperor's role was less about spectacle and more about endurance. The imperial study, though private by court standards, was still far from solitary. A semicircle of scribes waited along one wall, ready to take dictation or fetch documents. Ministers logothetes filed in with their portfolios, each representing a pillar of the state: finance, the military, foreign affairs, the grain supply, the post. Each man carried not only papers, but also carefully rehearsed arguments for why his department's needs should come before the rest. The emperor's task was to listen, question, and decide, or at least appear to decide. In truth, much of this was a careful dance between genuine rulership and the necessity of maintaining competing factions in delicate balance. First came the logothetes to Genikou, the Minister of Finance, always near the top of the queue because, in Byzantium as in the modern world, money set the tempo for everything else. He presented figures written in precise columns, tax revenues from the provinces, tribute from vassal states, and the endless expenditures of war, fortifications, and court life. A skilled finance minister would try to slip bad news in between two items of good news, perhaps announcing a successful customs levy increase before revealing a deficit caused by a failed harvest in Thrace. The emperor, schooled in this tactic, often let the man talk himself into a corner before quietly asking how much coin was actually in the treasury. The answer was rarely as optimistic as the opening report. Next might be the logothetes to Dromau, responsible for both the imperial postal system and intelligence gathering. Officially, his business was letters and messengers. Unofficially, it was espionage. He brought sealed reports from spies stationed in foreign courts, notes from informants in provincial cities, and coded warnings about possible conspiracies closer to home. Some were urgent, others little more than court gossip, dressed up as intelligence. The emperor would read the summaries in silence, occasionally raising an eyebrow at particularly bold rumours, like the one about a provincial governor keeping an astrologer on retainer to predict the emperor's death. Anna, stationed at her writing desk near the window, recorded every exchange with deliberate care. Her task was not only to capture decisions, but also to note tone, pauses, and offhand remarks. These would matter later, when ministers inevitably disputed what had been said. She had learned long ago that the imperial word was slippery, sometimes intentionally so. The emperor might say, "We will look into this matter," knowing full well that "we" meant someone else entirely, and that "look into" could mean burying the problem in bureaucracy until it expired on its own. Marcos, ever the shadow at the emperor's shoulder, served as both a gatekeeper and a barometer. He could sense when a minister was pushing too hard, when the emperor's patience was thinning, and when a topic should be dropped before it became dangerous. His eyes never left the room, scanning for any sign of overconfidence or concealed hostility. He knew that in this space words could topple careers faster than swords could. The desk work was not without its darker truths. Every decision here had ripples. Raising grain taxes in one province might fund a fortress in another, but it could also spark food riots. Diverting troops to defend the eastern border might leave the Balkans exposed. And there were always petitions for imperial funds to repair churches or monasteries, pious in appearance, but often thinly veiled bids to funnel wealth into a local magnate's pocket. The emperor had to navigate these with a blend of skepticism and strategy, all while maintaining the fiction that the empire's resources were infinite. Critics outside these walls might imagine the emperor as a figure weighed down by the burden of leadership, nobly sacrificing his own comfort for the good of the people. The truth was more pragmatic. This was governance as chess. Pieces moved not out of altruism, but to protect the king and maintain control of the board. If the people benefited in the process, so much the better. But it was never the primary goal. By midday, the desk would be covered in open scrolls, stamped decrees, and lead seals cooling in their wax impressions. The emperor's signet ring, heavy with its carved insignia, was pressed into document after document. Some bore the chrysoprol, the golden seal reserved for the most important decrees, while others received the simpler lead bulla. These seals were not mere bureaucratic flourishes. They were lifelines for those who received them, and sometimes death sentences for those they condemned. And still, for all this labour, much of the day's paperwork would vanish into the Byzantine archives, never to be acted upon. Decisions here could be decisive, or they could be performances of decisiveness. In Byzantium, ruling from the desk was as much about shaping perceptions as it was about shaping policy. The real art was knowing when those two aims overlapped, and when they did not. By the time the third minister bowed his way out, the emperor's desk looked like a battlefield with fewer corpses and more parchment, and the tempo changed from grand pronouncements to the granular grind that actually kept borders from fraying. For now, the logothetes to Stratiotikou arrived with payrolls for the tagmata and reports from the provincial themata, lists of spearheads ordered, horse fodder shipments delayed by flooded roads, a fort that needed stone, a garrison that needed a reason not to sell their shields. As he spoke in tight, trained phrases, the emperor traced a finger along the columns and asked the only question soldiers everywhere fear and respect. How many men can stand on a given morning, and how many more will stand if we pay them on time? Because in Byzantium, loyalty was a stipend with a hem attached, and if the stipend wavered, the hem went silent. Orders went out to divert a portion of customs from the Komikaion at the harbour to the quartermaster, and Marcos murmured to a Chartularios to make sure the paper trail looked pious rather than panicked, since nothing turns a minor adjustment into a scandal faster than a ledger that smells of fear. Then came the Sakalarios, guardian of the central purse, with a face like a locked chest and a suggestion to shave a sliver off certain provincial remittances by redefining what counted as extraordinary expense, a phrase that could mean a storm, a church roof, or a duke's inconvenient nephew. The emperor listened without blinking because the trick of solvency is not avoiding pain, but distributing it with plausible theology. Anna wrote the phrasing carefully, prudential moderation of burdens, a phrase that reads like mercy and feels like a tax. And the day rolled on into the realm of letters themselves, drafts becoming decrees, decrees becoming seals, hot wax cooling in neat circles as the signet bit down. A domestic instruction took lead, a treaty demanded gold, and when the crucible was called for, the gold seal was lifted from its velvet box as if it were a sacrament, which in this city it arguably was. The emperor spoke slowly while Anna matched him, the clauses stacked like stones, each comma a hinge on which a province might swing, and when the phrasing brushed against sensitive doctrine, he paused for the Chartophylax, keeper of archives and expert in the dangerous art of memory, to fetch a precedent that said a previous ruler had once meant almost this, said almost that, and somehow the almost would be enough. Because consistency comforts even when it constrains, yet beneath the varnish of procedure, the darker current ran. Reports from the Dromos flagged a courier missing on the mountain road to Nicaea bandits perhaps, or a lord testing how much the centre notices when the arteries clog, and the emperor ordered a double relay of fresh mounts, tighter escort, fewer eyes, because the safest message is the one everyone sees leaving and no one sees arriving. A cipher clerk slipped in with a narrow face and ink-nicked fingers to ask whether the new substitution table should rotate weekly or by saints' days. Anna kept her expression neutral, while Marcos, who distrusted cleverness that could not hold a door, recommended weeks, saints being politicized more often than calendars. Then a petition wrapped in piety arrived from a monastery, pleading exemption from a timber levy due to the sanctity of their newly discovered relic, a splinter startlingly similar to last year's splinter. The emperor, who preferred miracles that balanced books, granted a partial exemption paired with the obligation to host travellers on feast days, which sounded holy and calculated to save the state money on inns. Meanwhile, the military papers returned with marginal notes from a general whose handwriting looked like a battle map. He needed surgeons, not more icons. He needed nails and boot leather, not a sermon. And the emperor, who understood the value of both, issued funds for medics and ordered an icon painted for the fort chapel anyway, because morale is cheaper than replacements, and the soul likes to feel watched while the hand grips the spear. Then the foreign desk unfolded its thin stack of worries. A Venetian envoy flattering the throne while asking for another tariff concession. A steppe chieftain sending horses with one letter and raiders with the next. A border emir proposing a pause in skirmishes that read like an offer to reload in comfort. And here the desk became a chessboard, the emperor approving a draft reply that praised friendship, promised nothing, and invited everything. Gold might oil the answer, or a marriage might, and somewhere a princess counted as policy, a truth no scribe wrote plainly. Anna wrote it plainly to herself, in the margins she would later scrape, palimpsests being the empire's polite way of forgetting. And always the seals, lead and gold, cooling into certainty, which was the point, for nothing in Byzantium was certain until it weighed something. The afternoon wore on, lamps were trimmed, the air grew heavier with wax and dust, and tedium, that underrated ally of power, did its work. Because a minister grows less dangerous when he is tired of his own voice, Marcos maintained the cadence of entrances and exits, so that rivals never overlapped longer than politeness required, while the emperor kept the room slightly cooler than comfortable, a small trick that discouraged speeches and encouraged crisp decisions. Criticism threaded the day like a hair in the soup, because even here, in the sanctum of competence, the empire's bad habits showed. Documents multiplied to prove a decision had happened, then multiplied again to explain why it hadn't. Optimistic ledgers treated tomorrow like it owed today an apology, and the same three families' names circled the margins of contracts like gulls over a fish market. Yet the machine worked, not gracefully, not morally, but mechanically. Because enough ink becomes law, and enough law becomes habit, and enough habit, repeated under domes and over porphyry, convinces a capital that the centre is solid. As the last docket closed, the emperor flexed a hand cramped by the pressure of rings and responsibility. Anna sanded the final lines and blew them dry. Marcos signalled the door, and the desk, crowded, scarred, indispensable, exhaled with them. The empire had been ruled for another slice of daylight, not with thunder or miracles, but with commas, columns, and the polite tyranny of the seal. Chapter 7. Midday, piety and a measured meal. When the last seal cooled and the last minister withdrew, the palace shifted key, the way a choir moves from psalm to hymn. The doors to the inner chapel opened, and the smell of ink gave way to frankincense rising like pale ribbons in the warm air. The emperor stepped into a hush that was not silence so much as reverence, arranged by professionals, lamps trimmed, icons glittering in their gold fields, a cantor holding the first note, just long enough to pull every drifting mind back to the idea that power, if it is to look respectable, must appear to kneel. Marcos cleared the threshold with two measured glances, one for threats that never announce themselves, one for courtiers who try to look humble and only manage hungry, while Anna took her quiet place behind a pillar where the acoustics folded sound into her notes. The liturgy short by design, a chain of petitions and litanies that washed the morning's bargaining from the emperor's face without disturbing the makeup of authority beneath. And if anyone wondered whether heaven minded being used as a palate cleanser for politics, no one said so, because Byzantium preferred questions that answered themselves with incense. The priest intoned the prayer for rulers and armies, for rains in their season, for the city's peace, for enemies at sea to forget their oars and return to their mothers. The emperor crossed himself with calm exactness, a movement practiced enough to read as nature, and the choir layered voices until the marble trembled, which is to say the acoustics did what devotion is often asked to do. The service ended with a blessing that touched everyone present like a cool hand, and then the purposeful drift began toward the washing ewers, silver birds pouring perfumed water over imperial fingers, the towel folded and offered with a bow so narrow it could cut, because cleanliness here was half sanitation, half sacrament, and entirely optics. Afterward, the little procession turned toward the midday table, which is never called lunch, because that sounds too ordinary for a city that stores its tomatoes in a future century. The dining room bright without being merry, sunlight taking inventory of gilded plates, while servants arranged the choreography of appetite and anxiety. The first rule of imperial meals being that nothing is eaten until someone else survives it, so the taster stepped forward with a face like a locked door and sampled each dish in order, sips of watered wine, cautious bites from bowls of barley and wheat bread, a spoonful of lentil stew sharpened with vinegar and coriander, a cautious nibble of river fish basted with gyros, the old fish sauce that smelled like a sin but tasted like a plan, slices of kid roasted with thyme, a small salad of cucumbers and herbs which the physician eyed with professional dislike, declaring cucumbers cold and moist, and therefore unfit for a ruler who, the physician, a disciple of Galen with an ego to match, advised moderation as if he had invented it. He recommended pears stewed with honey for a gentle stomach, almonds for clean strength, figs for agreeable sweetness, and dilution of wine in a ratio that guaranteed sobriety would outvote daring. The cupbearer strained the wine through a fine cloth anyway to catch sediment and, if fate were feeling theatrical, anything less edible. The emperor sat, not reclined like a Roman of earlier centuries, posture erect, cloak eased back by a chamberlain so the fabric could breathe without looking like it needed to. The meal proceeded at a pace set by etiquette rather than hunger, bread broken, not hacked, bites measured so words could fit between them, because even meals were meetings. Messengers slid in with the glide of well-bred cats and deposited notes near the salt, a petition from a monastery seeking permission to expand its fish ponds, a line from the harbour master about a damaged crane, a rumour dressed as intelligence suggesting a governor's nephew had begun buying more silk than his salary permitted. Marcos sifted these with a nod or a raised brow, a code learned over decades and legible to exactly 3 people in the room. Anna ate quickly when no one looked, a small plate of olives and cheese and barley cake, then bent back to her notes because narratives do not pause for lunch, and the empire's memory has to be written while it is still warm. Entertainment, in the lightest sense of the word, threaded the edges, a sultry murmuring, a melody that knew better than to compete with policy, a reciter offering a saint's life in a tone that made righteousness sound like logistics, and the surgeon from the morning reports drifted in to whisper that the garrison at the river fort had fewer fevers, now that garlic rations were up, proof that medicine sometimes wins arguments the treasurer never intended to lose. The emperor listened with the face of a man considering whether, approving an extra shipment of vinegar for cleaning blades, and a small stipend for linen to bandage whatever courage could not prevent. Every few minutes, the physician returned to the attack, reminding the table that onions inflame choler, that too much pepper excites dangerous spirits, that roasted meats should be followed by greens, that a ruler who eats like a reveller will soon rule like one, which was fair and also annoying. But the empire was built as much on restraint as on cavalry. Forks appeared, small and two-pronged, not yet a scandal in the West because the West had not been invited to dinner. The emperor used one to lift a piece of fish as neatly as a signature, and if anyone muttered that decadence had invented an unnecessary tool, they forgot that cleanliness is a kind of power, and grease on royal fingers writes sloppy decrees. The darker truths of the table circled like discreet flies, the knowledge that more than one emperor in history learned the taste of bitterness disguised as almond, that tasters kept their wills updated, that kitchens burn as often as armies do, that scalded scullions are cheaper than silk but easier to forget, and that the charity of the morning had fed a story as much as stomachs. The measured meal could pivot without warning into policy. A bishop admitted to report a quarrel between 2 abbots about a boundary stone was told to remind both men that monks who cannot agree on where a rock belongs should try poverty without roofs for a season. A merchant, praised for his generosity to a hospital, was reminded that generosity advertised too loudly has a price list, and between honeyed pears and the final sip of wine diluted to virtue, a decision slid into the world with the quiet of a cat placing a paw. A decree that the grain warehouses would open an hour earlier during the fasts, because piety that gnaws at the stomach is piety that riots by sunset, and riots stain marble, which costs more than mercy. The emperor rose when the physician announced the pulse was calm and the eyes bright, which might have been true or might have been theatre. The towel returned, the final blessing made, and the party dissolved into the corridor's cooler air, a thin sweetness of mastic lingering as if the room preferred to keep something of them. The meal had not dazzled, and was not meant to. It had reaffirmed the premise that a ruler who intends to last must eat like a monk disguised as a statue. Modest portions, many cautions, decisions salted to taste, and a schedule so exact it could be played on a drum. The afternoon waited with inspections and processions. The city waited with its 1,000 appetites, and somewhere a kitchen boy counted his fingers after the knife work and decided to pray for the emperor because it never hurts to shield your wages with heaven. After the last crumb had been brushed from the cloth and the cupbearer's careful dilution had left the emperor awake instead of heroic, the midday ritual slipped into its gentler coda, a pause that pretended to be rest while remaining a ledger of obligations, for there were thank offerings to acknowledge, discreet gifts to dispatch, a brief return to the chapel for the 6th hour if the calendar insisted, and a visit to the small treasury where alms were counted with pious expressions and very secular arithmetic. Marcos guiding the flow so that generous faces were seen and remembered, and expensive favours were neither promised nor accidentally implied, because nothing drains a coffers faster than compassion itemized. On major feast days, the pattern widened, and the emperor moved in measured procession to Hagia Sophia, under a canopy held by men whose hands could not shake. The route swept clean by silentiarii, the streets pressed full of eyes that wanted spectacle more than theology, and got both. Trumpets blared, and the city behaved, mostly, since even reverence can jostle when it realizes it is standing near power. The narthex received him with sober grandeur. The nave opened like a sea of light, and the dome floated as if the architect had bribed gravity. Incense curled up into acres of gold tesserae and fell back down as mood. The patriarch's voice climbed the vault and rested there like a standard on still air, while the emperor stood in a place that was not exactly among men and not quite among angels, a usefulness that theology rarely admits but politics devours. Anna, tucked near a pillar where echoes arrive with footnotes, recorded the petitions woven into liturgy: rain for parched fields, peace for nagging borders, safe harbour for ships heavy with grain, steady hearts for rulers who must pretend steadiness is natural. She added a private line about the crowd's faces, some rapt, some calculating, some simply grateful to cool their feet on polished stone, and another about the old woman who crossed herself so fiercely she could not help but be noticed by heaven or a chamberlain. Back in the palace precincts, the afternoon slid into a quiet inspection circuit. Gardens first, because even emperors require proof that something in their jurisdiction obeys them without argument. Cypresses exact as lances. Laurel hedges clicked as if they reported for drill. A pool tilting a bright duplicate of the sky that made the day look expensive. Peacocks performed their pointless magnificence. Ducks made low bureaucratic noises, and a keeper approached with a bow deep enough to water the shrubs, receiving a nod and a purse for the aviary, because beauty earns its stipend when soldiers march past it and believe civilization is worth defending. Yet the sweetness carried its own bitterness, as it always does here, for the great palace kept a menagerie whose rarities were occasionally fed better than dock workers, and the gardeners who pruned the emperor's shade sometimes slept in rooms that never cooled. The empire's priorities, arranged like a mosaic that sparkled from the centre and gritted at the edges. From the garden, the path bent toward the hospital and orphan house endowed by earlier rulers, and whether the emperor visited in person or sent a gift with blessing depended on the calendar and the number of daggers rumour had counted that week. Today Prudence chose a gift linen, oil, coin, and a polite inspection of ledgers rather than beds. The administrator assured that the poor were tended, the sick washed with vinegar, the bread steady, which might be true and, if not, would become true for as long as the imperial gaze burned, a mercy with a timer. Marcos watched the steward's hands more than his mouth, counting whether gratitude outpaced fright, while Anna noted the list of donors read aloud with Piety, a clever device that turned charity into reputation and reputation into revenue. The emperor's face remained the smooth surface policy prefers, approving an extra barrel of oil for winter sores and a small stipend for the woman who trained orphan boys to read contracts before they learned to sign their names, a kindness that would cost the treasury silver and save it gold. Returning indoors, the physicians reappeared with the zeal of men who love rules more than sleep, taking the royal pulse as if it were a treaty, recommending a brief walk under shade to aid digestion, forbidding figs in quantity, praising pears again, scowling at pepper because it makes the blood ambitious, which is the last thing a palace needs after noon. The emperor complied with the grace of a man who understands that obedience, when public, is another kind of command. A short stroll followed along the covered porticos, the city's sea salt breath arriving in draughts, and with it the stubby harmony of Constantinople conducting its own day, smiths beating red iron into argument, hawkers proving that lungs are a profession, children chasing each other with the economy of people who know better than to fall hard on stone. The emperor looked without staring, because staring promises what looking only registers. A delegation intercepted him, 2 senators and a guildmaster with an honest sweat, petitioning for leniency on a shipment delayed by contrary winds and inconvenient customs agents. And here the lunch's restraint paid dividends. The reply even, the judgment precise, a reduction of fees contingent on proof, and a reprimand for the harbour official wrapped in honey, so it could be swallowed without being forgotten. Criticism threaded the mercy because approval without edges is how laziness breeds. Then the last private act of the midday cycle, a return to the robing chamber not to change rank but to change weather, the heavy cloak exchanged for a lighter mantle, the red boots rebuffed so that afternoon sun could practice glory on them, a sleeve adjusted so the embroidered cross aligned with the wrist veins. details that sound small and are actually policy, since the next hours will live in public eyes. Marcos made a final pass through the routes and ensured the silentiarii had tightened the palace like a drum. Anna sanded her notes, stowed the morning in order, and sharpened her reed for whatever the afternoon decided to call wisdom. And as the clock no one could see but everyone obeyed, struck its invisible mark, the emperor inhaled the calibrated air of ceremony and motion. The measured meal had done its primary work, not to feed hunger, but to bind appetite to caution, not to celebrate, but to exact the price of clarity. Now the city would be allowed to see him move through it, and if the day had a secret, it was this: digestion, doctrine, and diplomacy are neighbours who share a wall, knock on one, and the others answer. The procession callers were already assembling in the outer court, standards unrolled, harness buckles checked, horses chewing as if they were rehearsing a public courtesy, and the afternoon prepared to turn its gears, smooth where it could, loud where it must, toward inspections and processions that would convert posture into policy, distance into authority, and sunlight into a sermon no one could claim they hadn't heard. Chapter 8. The Emperor in Motion, Inspections and Processions. The midday shift marked a subtle yet necessary transition, from the calculated tranquility of meals and petitions to the orchestrated frenzy of public inspections and processions. The emperor, now resplendent in his lighter mantle and freshly polished boots, moved from his private chambers toward the first of his public duties. The great palace, with its marble halls and frescoed walls, had its own rhythm, a rhythm that made the emperor a part of the architecture, both a pillar and a shadow. As he passed through the halls, Marcos stayed close by, his eyes scanning the room in the way only a chamberlain knows how. Every eye on the emperor, every gesture, was designed to magnify his presence. The slow, almost ceremonial walk toward the imperial gates was less a walk and more an announcement, a statement made in footfalls. Each step seemed to carry the weight of both the emperor's person and the centuries of tradition that hung on his every motion. He was the living embodiment of the state, a body in motion with the power to still the world around him. Beyond the gates, the sun beat down on the palace courtyard, and the noise of the city outside began to mingle with the buzz of soldiers lining the path, courtiers gathering, and the sounds of horses snorting in preparation. The emperor's daily inspections had a way of pulling the city into its orbit. The crowd that had gathered knew they were not simply witnessing a ruler, they were watching the myth in motion, the living symbol of divine favour clothed in silks and gold. It was a far cry from the hunger they'd been given in the bread courtyard earlier, but in Byzantium, image outweighed substance more often than not. The emperor's procession was a study in choreography, the sort of public spectacle that could only exist in a world where power and pageantry were fused so thoroughly that one could not survive without the other. The silentiarii, ever vigilant, led the way, clearing the space in front of the emperor with stern, practiced gestures. As they walked, the path was cleared, not just of obstacles but of doubt. No one, not even the beggars who would linger near the gates, could afford to look too long at the emperor without risk of being silently dismissed. Averted eyes were as much a part of the pageantry as the raised banners or the mounted guards. Each soldier, each servant, each courtier who lined the processional route was a component of the greater spectacle, a piece of the emperor's personal theatre. The lower ranks, carefully curated for visual effect, were there to represent the empire's strength, as if their presence alone could make the emperor seem more imposing, more secure. Meanwhile, the higher-born members of the court lingered just close enough to remind the people that even the emperor's power was a constant negotiation. Their smiles, their looks of deference, and the brief exchanges with one another were reminders that power is best served with a side of careful calculation. As the emperor moved, so too did his authority. The public rituals of the procession were not meant to reflect the true workings of governance, but rather to reinforce the emperor's status as the pivot on which the entire empire turned. A processional route that stretched from the palace gates to the hippodrome, through streets lined with gold-threaded curtains, became a vehicle for ideology more than it did for governance. It was, after all, easier to glorify the emperor's wealth and grace than it was to resolve the nagging problems that cropped up in provinces across the empire. Marcos knew the choreography well. he had seen the emperor's gaze shift ever so slightly to one of the younger generals who stood at attention in his armour, glinting in the sunlight. The subtle nod that followed was not for the general's performance on the battlefield, but a silent acknowledgement of his loyalty in this moment, his place in the grand scheme of things. Marcos did not need to read the emperor's mind to know that this particular soldier was being positioned for a higher post, one that would benefit both the emperor's reign and, more practically, his personal favour. The emperor's smile, brief as it was, flashed like a brief spark of light. It was designed not to warm, but to remind those in its orbit that, like the sun, he could cast both heat and shadow in equal measure. Those who caught his glance felt chosen, but those who missed it, they might as well have been invisible, too far from the rays of imperial favour. To be ignored by the emperor was the quietest punishment, one that drained as surely as a public reprimand. In Byzantium, subtlety in the art of discipline was as much a weapon as any sword, and it cut deeper than any spoken threat. And then came the banners. Their intricate designs, woven with thread imported from lands far beyond the Byzantine borders, rippled in the breeze. They were not just symbols of military might, but of the divine providence that had been bestowed upon the emperor. To walk beneath those banners was to pass through the shadow of God himself, and in that space the emperor was more than just a ruler. He was a divine agent. The banners fluttered like the wings of angels, or perhaps more fittingly, like the ruffled feathers of ravens, always watching, always poised to act. The procession's final stop was always the hippodrome, that grand, sprawling arena where the emperor's true strength was tested by the spectacle of chariot races and the cheers of the crowd. Here, the lines between reality and performance blurred even more. It was impossible to tell where the emperor ended and the empire began. The mob roared its approval of his presence, and the cheers could be heard echoing off the marble and stone. The grand spectacle of the emperor's motion was now complete, but even here, in the dazzling arena where horses galloped and chariots crashed, the emperor never truly let his guard down. He knew, as all wise rulers do, that the crowd could roar for you today and call for your head tomorrow. The cheering was as much about ensuring his reign would not falter as it was about reinforcing the empire's fragile sense of unity. For all the grandeur, for all the theatrics, the truth remained. Byzantium was a kingdom constantly teetering between grace and chaos, and the emperor was the only thing keeping the fall at bay, or at least that was the story he sold. And as the procession concluded, as the dust settled in the hippodrome, and the emperor stepped down from his chariot to make his final gestures to the crowd, Marcos could see it clearly. The show was over for today. But tomorrow, the game would begin again. The machinery of empire would hum once more, with the emperor at its centre, always on display, always in motion. As the emperor's procession finally circled the hippodrome and the last echoes of chariot wheels faded from the dusty stones, the crowd slowly began to thin. The day's grand spectacle had ended, but its echoes, like the fraying tail of a comet, lingered in the air. The emperor, having performed his part in full, retreated into the more private halls of the palace, leaving behind a trail of whispers and admiring glances. The sun, which had so recently bathed the imperial procession in golden glory, now cast its more impartial light upon the rest of the city. But in the shadow of the emperor's passing, the city still felt the ripples of the grand performance. Marcos, ever observant, followed closely behind, his eyes scanning the shifting tides of court life. The clamour of the crowd, though distant, still buzzed in the air, a reminder of the emperor's magnetic effect on the masses. But for those like Marcos, who had seen the emperor move through these motions countless times, there was nothing new under the sun. The people cheered, the emperor smiled, the chariots raced, and the city carried on as it always did. In some ways, it was the most predictable part of the day, the spectacle. What followed, however, was far less certain. The emperor's return to the palace was often followed by a quieter phase in the day, one that offered more room for reflection than performance. But even then, as the emperor settled into his private chambers, there were always matters to address. Those matters, often far more tedious and weighty than the grand ceremony of public spectacle, would now occupy the rest of his afternoon. As the emperor entered his chambers, The chamberlains quickly adjusted the flow of the room. The incense from earlier was replaced with a fresher, sharper scent, myrrh and cinnamon, meant to invigorate rather than soothe. The attendants, who had been primed for a day of pageantry, now shifted into their more functional roles. The imperial guards took their posts, the scribes laid out the day's scrolls and petitions, and the inner sanctum of the emperor's court came to life in a quieter, more business-like manner. But the emperor's mind, like the empire itself, could never fully rest. Even in these quieter moments, his thoughts circled, ever restless. A fresh report arrived from the eastern frontier, where tensions with neighbouring tribes were bubbling again. A grain merchant, who had been rumoured to be hoarding, was to be brought in for questioning. A high-ranking noble had made an unexpected visit to the palace, quiet enough that only the most careful courtiers had noticed, but loud enough that Marcos felt his ears prickle. Such visits were never without consequence. Anna, always at the ready, took her place at the corner of the room, watching the emperor as he reviewed the reports. The day's performance had been flawless, but this was the real work of ruling. The scrutiny of numbers, the weighing of allegiances, the subtle politics that played out in whispered tones behind closed doors. There was little glory here, only the weight of decisions that would carve their mark on the empire for years to come. One of the first orders of business was the troubling report from the eastern frontier. The emperor's brow furrowed slightly as he scanned the document, the words tribal alliance and aggression standing out like warnings. He muttered to himself, just loud enough for Marcos to catch, another border to secure, another campaign to fight. The empire is never full, is it? There was no sarcasm in his voice, no lightness, just a tired acknowledgement of the fact that expansion, peace or security were never truly settled in the Byzantine world. There was always a new threat, a new frontier, a new challenge to face. And so, the wheel of the empire turned. But even as he faced this troubling news, the emperor did not allow the air in the room to grow heavy. He remained focused, practical, the emperor everyone in the room had learned to expect, calm, distant, and utterly pragmatic. A decision would be made, likely before the day's end, on whether the empire's legions should move eastward again. Plans would be drawn up, forces mobilized. Lives would be lost in distant lands, and the emperor would sign the orders with the same practiced ease with which he had approved the previous petition on grain prices. The mechanics of empire were always in motion. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in much the same way. Letters were dispatched, commands issued, messages sent to the various governors and generals who served the emperor. Even as a servant brought the emperor his customary light repast, simple breads, honeyed wine, a few fruits, the room hummed with the low, relentless hum of governance. There were no cheers here, no adoring crowds. There were only numbers and names, decisions and strategies, all pressing forward with the same inevitability as the emperor's own heartbeat. And in this mundane pulse of administration, there was something subtly dark about the emperor's role. To the people, he was an image, magnificent, powerful, an almost mythical figure. But to those who served him, those who made the empire run, the emperor was something else entirely, a necessity that could never be avoided, a figure who had to be present in every decision, no matter how small or tedious. In Byzantium, the emperor was both a symbol and a machine. To stand beneath his gaze was to be part of the imperial performance. But to be the emperor was to live a life that was, at times, less about grandeur and more about maintaining the machinery, adjusting the gears, checking the oil, ensuring that the empire, with all its fragility, stayed on course. This, it seemed, was the real work of an emperor, never truly at rest, always adjusting, always moving. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting its long shadows across the marble floors of the palace, the emperor stood from his desk and prepared to move on to the next phase of his day, the evening banquet. But even here, in the gleaming halls filled with food and wine, the emperor's role would not change. He would still be the centerpiece of it all, the living symbol of the empire, the figure whose presence was enough to keep the illusion of power intact. It was in moments like these, when the day's grandeur faded into routine, that the true cost of the emperor's role became evident. There was no room for error, no space for misstep. Each gesture, each decision, had to be made with the knowledge that it would be scrutinized, interpreted, and ultimately immortalized in the records. To rule was to be endlessly on display, to navigate through the labyrinth of court and empire, never fully able to rest. The emperor's motion, like the empire itself, never stopped. Chapter 9. Councils and ceremony, strategy, culture, and the banquet. The palace exhaled the day's dust and inhaled lamps. Dusk flattened the courtyards into sheets of bronze, while the council chamber gathered heat and nerves, a long room where maps lay pinned by knife points and little tin soldiers waited to be moved by men who would never see the mud. The emperor entered without hurry, wearing the evening mantle that darkened him into an outline. Kings learn early, less a person than a border. Marcos arranged the seating with the ruthlessness of a chess player who treats chairs like pieces. Proximity means influence. Distance means homework. Anna took her corner beneath a fresco of a ship whose painted sail never tires, pen ready, eyes patient, recording not only what is said, but what is meant, which is the sport of Byzantium. First came the war talk that pretends not to be hungry. The strategos from the eastern marches bowed low, raised his finger, and drew a line across wax to show where raids had become habit. He asked for men, then horses, then money, in that order, because he is not a fool. The master of horse offered numbers that multiplied handsomely on parchment and die slowly in snow. The emperor listened like a bank vault, then asked the question every campaign hates: how long until the road eats us? The transport officer admitted the obvious, that courage is cheap at noon and very expensive at midnight. So the plan bent toward fortified halts, tighter supply relays, surgeons paid in advance, and a letter to a monastery about boots, because piety that ties leather is piety that shortens wars. Light criticism threaded every approval. Waste is treason in a whispering city. Diplomacy swam in next, perfumed and carnivorous. The Logothete of the Dromos summarized letters from Venice that sounded like friendship and smelled like tariffs. An emir on the border proposed a truce long enough to sharpen both sides' knives. A prince by the sea offered marriage that came with ships, which is to say with arguments. The emperor dictated replies in phrases that shone when held at one angle and vanished at another, promising audiences, hinting at favors, naming nothing, because the empire negotiates like a cat crosses a courtyard, graceful, uncommitted, in possession of all four exits. Anna salted the margins with the older precedents, those comfortable ghosts councils summoned to make novelty look traditional. Then culture, which in this court is not a hobby but an instrument. The protovestiarios announced the evening symposium program, a hymn, a reading from a pious author who believed sentences should carry a lantern, a rhetorical contest presented by two scholars who despised each other with exquisite courtesy. The emperor approved with the faintest nod, the one that says art must earn its bread like soldiers do. A minor poet begged permission to recite lines celebrating the morning's almsgiving. Marcos granted it while quietly ensuring the poet would stand far from the emperor's cup. The physician, who loves rules more than rhymes, requested that the music not exceed a certain brightness, lest digestion grow adventurous. No one laughed because Galen outlives jesters. The council turned domestic, which is to say, dangerous. A senator wanted a tax clarified so his friends could misunderstand it profitably. A bishop demanded a judgment on relics too enthusiastic to be plausible. A guildmaster argued for looser inspection of scales for the sake of commerce, which is a phrase moths use for fabric. The emperor's answers walked the narrow bridge between example and exception, a temporary relief paired with a permanent audit, permission to venerate with an instruction to measure, a blessing for trade stapled to fines for false weights. Byzantium does not fix problems, it teaches them manners. Dark facts breathed at the edges, as they always do here. A parchment arrived, folded like a secret and smelling of wax. It named a noble who bought soldiers' loyalties with parties that ended in oaths. The Varangian captain, who prefers truth large enough to swing, asked permission to correct the matter with axes. The emperor preferred accounts. Money traced, gifts recorded, favours salted away for the useful hour. Blinding is quick, ledgers are eternal. The captain looked disappointed, which is how you know he is honest. At a pause, the doors sighed and servants brought the council's modest fortification. Bowls of almonds, figs glossed with honey, watered wine strained through cloth, fine enough to catch either sediment or the career of a fool. The taster performed his small martyrdom with the dignity of a man who has memorized his will. The emperor drank as one consults a map. Conversation loosened, just enough to reveal alliances. A glance traded, a joke offered, a silence kept. Anna noted the silences most. Words can be forced, quiet is elective. The evening's tone turned ceremonial without admitting it had done so. The emperor stood, which in this room means the debate has been framed, and the day's decisions will now be curated. Seals would follow elsewhere. Here he gave shape, not weight. Orders. The eastern road to be mended where spring floods broke its spine. The grain inspectors rotated so familiarity cannot learn the price of a bribe. The harbour cranes repaired with funds scraped from ornamental excess. Let the peacocks molt, he said, which counts as cruelty only if you are a peacock. Marcos received the list like a gambler arranging coins. He would spend attention where money cannot reach. From council to ceremony, the corridor shortened time. Musicians tuned in a side hall, with the caution of men who know volume is political. The banquet space glowed, lamps nested in gilt, cloth that had been dyed with the patience of 1,000 snails, tables laid not to feed hunger but to stage order. The automata would not be deployed tonight. Mechanical lions rest like everyone else, but a silver tree with glass birds waited to tinkle a breeze no window offered. The seating plan, a novella written in place settings, said who was powerful, who was forgiven, who would soon be neither. Before he took his chair, the emperor paused before an icon whose gold remembered every prayer spoken to it, crossing himself with the same measured economy he used on treaties. The gesture was piety, signal, habit, and sometimes comfort. Then the master of ceremonies intoned the opening formula. The room answered with a ripple of rehearsed wonder, and the night's other labour began, the labour of eating beautifully. In Byzantium, strategy wears armour in the afternoon and silk at dusk. Either way, it marches. Chapter 10. Nightfall in the purple, family, devotion and security. Evening in the great palace did not arrive the way it comes to ordinary houses. It was not a soft dimming but a managed descent. Lamps raised in sequence, corridors thinned of traffic, voices lowered by habit rather than kindness, and the air perfumed just enough to make clean feel like policy. The empress stepped from the banquet into the private precincts that courtiers imagined as gentle, a vision of children, prayer, and rest, and found instead the most intricate machinery of the day. Night here was not quiet, it was organized. The cubicularii set the tempo, eunuchs who ruled the thresholds between public and private with keys that sounded like discretion. The kubuklion, the imperial bedchamber, waited with curtains drawn and icons lit, a domesticated chapel where sleep was expected to behave. A physician touched the wrist. A cupbearer offered a diluted draught scented with mastic. The taster performed his brief, unhappy profession again, and a scribe placed on a side table a tablet for notes that no one would admit had been written after Compline. Family entered in a measured ripple. The empress, whose presence eased the edges of the day while reminding every eye that dynasty is policy and silk, spoke with that practical tenderness. Palaces teach, the children, if they appeared, were carefully timed. Never at the hour when ministers might still seek a last word, always when affection could be seen without being charged to the treasury. A short reading from a life of a saint, chosen for patience rather than martyrdom, because palaces already have enough knives, and then the household crossed itself together. The priest blessed the room, and the door narrowed again. Critics outside liked to imagine softness here, but softness was rationed like sugar. The emperor's pillow was stuffed with wool, not miracles. Security grew larger as the family receded. Marcos made the rounds that no analyst celebrates, checking seals on service doors, listening for the sound a careless hinge makes, confirming that the night roster had been copied correctly, and that the man who slept closest to the imperial threshold had earned the privilege of being bored. The Varangian captain exchanged the day's heavy show for the leaner economy of night, axes grounded, patrols braided so that no path through the palace went unwatched for longer than a prayer. The watchwords for the outer and inner rings were changed and recorded in 2 hands, Anna's among them, and the old water clock began its slow, confident drip beside a sand glass that preferred to hurry. Torches were spaced to eliminate shadows wide enough to hide a man, a detail learned from a century of disasters that official histories file under providence. The city beyond maintained its own darkness, punctured by tavern doors and the lanterns of fishermen who trusted the Marmara more than they trusted tax collectors. But the palace tried to pretend the city did not exist after Vespers. It did, of course. Reports trickled in from the eparch's men. Night patrols that walked the markets to shame thieves with lamplight. Notes about a brawl between two charioteer factions that fizzled when the wine ran out. Whispers that a moneylender had found religion at sword point. Nothing explosive, everything instructive. The emperor read the briefest summary and wrote 3 words that said more than a sermon: tighten the scales. Justice at night wears short sentences. There was devotion too, and it was not entirely theatrical. In the small oratory near the bedchamber, a lamp burned before an icon whose gold had stored a century of whispered fear. The emperor stood there a few moments longer than protocol demanded, because even rulers know the difference between performance and need. He asked for ordinary things that sound extraordinary when an empire says them. Steady hands, quiet borders, safe sleep. He also asked for something petty and honest, that a troublesome cousin might discover tranquility in a monastery vault, rather than in succession. Sarcasm is a sin at the altar, but God, who knows palaces, likely smiled. Dark facts lay under the sheets. Byzantium knew how emperors die. Some lose the city in daylight, some lose breath at night. A cushion can be a theology, a draft can be a policy, a servant can be a future with a knife in it. This is why the night routine looked paranoid to poets and sensible to guards, why the cup lay upside down until it was needed, why the brazier embers were raked to show no powder had been sprinkled there, why the empress's women kept their own quiet roster, because a court that depends on a single heartbeat does not gamble on the honesty of air. Anna, done with the last entries, closed the daybook and walked the small, windowless corridor that led past the archive niche, where wax tablets slept like modest secrets. She allowed herself one unrecorded thought, that empires are at their truest when they are tired, because tired rulers stop lying to themselves about grandeur and start counting hazards. She had watched 3 seasons teach the same lesson, that stability is a stack of small precautions dressed as ceremony. Her quill had written down miracles no one saw and failures no one would admit, but she suspected the lamp list for the night might be the most important text in the room. At the 3rd watermark, the palace settled into its pattern of breaths. The outer gates were double barred, then sealed with wax stamped by a signet that pretended to be decisive. The inner courts went to half light, and the guards shifted from boots to felt so that security could hear itself think. Somewhere in the menagerie, a peacock made the sound peacocks make when they have not yet earned their keep. Somewhere in the kitchens, a scullion burned his thumb and discovered that pain respects neither rank nor curfew. The emperor, now undressed of everything except the office that cannot be removed, lay down on a bed that creaked like any other. Sleep was invited, not commanded. Before he let the day go, he spoke quietly to Marcos, who stood at the threshold and looked like a well-built lock, not about glory or poetry, but about the 3 smallest things that could endanger tomorrow: a hinge, a rumour, a bill. The Chamberlain nodded, the way men nod when the list is honest, and stepped back into the corridor where competence is a religion. The lamp was turned low, a final cross traced in the air, and silence resumed its work. Night in the purple had the calm of a treaty and the nerves of a siege. If grace visited, it came softly, as a weight lifted from the chest, as breath lengthening. Outside, Constantinople turned in its sleep and dreamed, as cities do, that morning would come on time. Inside, a palace dreamed nothing, it counted. The hinge that remembered insult, a draft that insisted on genealogy, a distant bell from the harbour that it could have been wages that insisted on genealogy, a distant bell from the harbour that could have been warning or a clumsy rope, Marcos did a last circuit of thresholds with the patience of a locksmith, and the skepticism of locksmith, and the skepticism of a historian. Fingers brushing seals to feel whether wax kept its temper, ears counting the interval between a sentry's step and his next. Men who stomp are brave, men who glide are awake. In the Kubukleon, the emperor slept the way rulers are permitted to, flat on his back as if negotiating go for to ravity, at everywhere and swaddled. The physician sat in the cup-ups with the Lothary of Grimember. The city outside performed its own liturgy, shutters clapping where taverns forgot manners, oars sighing, a dog telling philosophy to stones. And in the midst of this unwitnessed chorus, a soft knock arrived at the antechamber like a coin against a chalice, not loud but shaped. A night courier from the Dromos presented a sealed strip that smelled of horse and haste. Marcos broke it, eyes narrowing the way a gate narrows, handed it to Anna, already standing in a pool of lamplight with a hair pinned by resignation. The cipher table hung beside her desk like a saint of letters. She set to work, numbers pretending to be vowels, saints' names demoted to markers. Marcos weighed it, the way good men weigh bread, and decided he could wait for the emperor's first breath rather than his next. Mercy for sleep is good policy, still the night is an editor. He drafted 2 instructions in his own tidy hand, the watch to widen its ears on the sea road, the grain inspectors to count twice and smile half as much. Anna sanded the copies and stacked them beneath the seal that would kiss them at dawn. The physician coughed theatrically and prescribed an extra blanket for policy. He also recommended the emperor's head be slightly elevated to discourage dreams with hoofbeats, which is the kind of medicine that calms ministers. The Varangian captain, who dreamed of a different message slid in from the eparch, discreet and greasy. A moneylender had found religion. When a debtor's cousins arrived with liturgical knives, the cousins were now penitent, the moneylender devoutly generous, donations forthcoming to a hospital the emperor favoured. The city, as always, performing its arithmetic of sin and civic improvement. Anna entered it compactly, Charity noted, knives unmentioned, dark facts deserve small fonts. Somewhere a clock dripped, perfection auditioning as time. The emperor stirred once, not from nightmare but from habit. The body of a ruler does not trust oblivion. His lips moved in a line from a psalm he could say asleep, then quiet again. The empress's women changed the water in a bowl as if it were ceremony, which in palaces it is. Marcos paused on a stair to listen for the noise conspiracies make when they are trying to decide whether to be brave. There was no such noise, only the household's honest ones, felt on stone, cloth on wood, breath in duty's narrow harness. In the archive, Nish Anna scraped a palimpsest clean of a decade-old triumph. No one quoted anymore and copied a fresh inventory of lamps. She smiled without humour at the thought that light is the empire's favourite lie, and its most useful truth. Midnight thinned toward that crooked hour when wounds ache and ledgers feel heavier. The physician dozed and woke himself by agreeing with himself. The Varangian captain wrote a note about a loose shutter that had frightened 3 sentries into piety. Marcos signed the note as if shutters were treaties, because in this building they are, the menagerie muttered. A chained bear dreaming of rivers and diplomats. The city at the 5th water mark, the awakener's knuckles kissed the doorframe twice in the rhythm the day prefers. Not an alarm, an invitation. The emperor's eyes opened the way doors open for men who own keys. Marcos entered, report at the length of a well-made blade, 2 lines on the harbour, 1 on the border, and a final, domestic sentence about a hinge that would be quiet by noon or unemployed. The emperor listened with the piety he reserved for facts, nodded once, and let the morning begin to rehearse itself behind the curtains. Anna brought the clean script of the night in 6 sentences, none rhetorical, or with verbs that paid their rent. The cup turned right side up, the brazier surrendered its coals to fresh ones that had not yet considered treason, water warmed in silver throats, and the chapel lamps were coaxed awake by a thumb that knew exactly how much faith a wick requires. The palace inhaled, a small expensive dawn pushed its first coin of light along the cornices. The city answered with a pot banging and a gull that had never heard of theology. The emperor sat, not yet armoured by purple, but already wearing the posture that pays the empire's bills. The physician declared the pulse politic, which meant safe to be seen. The doors unlearned their secrecy, and the procession of privacy became again the corridor of rule. Before he stood, the emperor considered the quiet death that had not happened, and the louder ones he would have to prevent, made the sign that joins habit to hope, and heard the first footfall of the day he had already started. The palace, which knows circles better than lines, smiled its mosaic smile and offered him the original beginning. Candles, water, prayer, a chamberlain 3 paces ahead, and a throne that waits like a patient animal. You've been listening to The Drowsy Historian, where bedtime meets the Byzantine. If tonight's gold mosaics and quiet politics soothed your brain, subscribe and let the bell toll gently. No riots, just reminders. Tell me below, whose daily rituals should we unravel next? Emperor, Empress, or the poor Chamberlain holding the keys? Your likes and comments keep the lamps lit around here. Float over to the next episode on the right, or the full series playlist on the left. Until then, close your eyes, keep your ledgers honest, and good night.